The Reward of Enterprise by Muir. This is how it happened, said my friend Harborough. I'm a novelist, as you know, but if I hadn't had to take to writing, I'd have been a rolling stone by profession and by inclination. In my more philosophic moods, I perceive that really it was sheer luck, this occurrence about which you've asked me to tell you. I should never have made a success of any other trade but authorship. I'd have starved. Instead, I'm rather well off, as things go. But still, you understand I was by way of being a bit venturesome as a young man. I did a certain amount of journalism from time to time, but my secret hopes were set on all that is implied in that specious phrase, seeing the world. I wanted to see the world. Keeping this object in view, I shipped on a tramp steamer with whose captain I had struck up an acquaintanceship. Nominally, I was the purser. Actually, I was the captain's guest. Cargo boats, such as the SS Peterhof, do not employ a purser. No need to narrate the history of that voyage, nor dwell upon the trivial particulars of our life on board. Suffice it to say that in mid-Atlantic, our engines had a breakdown. The Peterhof came to a standstill. If it has ever happened to you during a big voyage, you will know that there is something portentous about the cessation of a steamer's machinery in mid-ocean. To be becalmed on a sailing ship may be boring. To be becalmed, if such an expression can be used, on a steamer is almost too queer to be boring. Day and night the engines have throbbed until their throbbing has penetrated into your very marrow, and when the throbbing abruptly dies, you are sensible of a shock. When the Peterhof halted, I ran up on deck as speedily as though we had had a collision. I saw, all round, nothing but sea, 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 and it was far more amazing than if I had beheld an island or an iceberg or a raft of shipwrecked mariners, or any of the other picturesque phenomena which my fertile fancy had hastened to invent as an explanation for our stoppage. The Peterhof's engines were antiquated, breakdowns had occurred before, and our two engineers, I learnt, would be able to effect a repair. 24 hours' labour would set us going again. It turned out to be only a slightly over-optimistic prophecy, and meanwhile we were free to admire, as best we might, the somewhat monotonous beauties of the Atlantic. There was not a breath of wind. The sun blazed from a cloudless sky. As long as the Peterhof had been in motion, we had considered the temperature fairly cool, but now that her motion was arrested, the heat became very noticeable. The sea was, in a sense, absolutely smooth, but its smoothness did not imply flatness, any more than the smoothness of a carpet's pile implies flatness if the carpet is being shaken. On the contrary, the Peterhof was rolling upon the undulations of a heavy groundswell. The surface of that groundswell was without a wrinkle, polished and glossy like lacquer, but its hills and its dales were gigantically high and deep, far higher and far deeper than I had realized until the engines relinquished their task of propelling us athwart them. Now, lying helpless upon the water, we swooped up to a glazed summit, swooped down to the bottom of a satiny gulf, swooped up again and down again in a splendid, even oscillation, and, this was what seemed so extraordinary to a landsman, in absolute silence. It was uncanny. Those fabulous billows never broke. There was not even a hiss of foam against the side of the steamer. The Peterhof just tobogganed down one stupendous gradient and up the next as though she had been sliding on oil. The thing fascinated me. I stood by the rail, reveling in this prodigious seesaw, and only gradually did it dawn upon me that we were not really rushing down one slant and up the next. We were only being lifted up and down vertically. This discovery sounds foolish, but I can't tell you how it excited me. I got an empty biscuit tin from the steward and threw it into the sea, as far as I could, and then watched it floating. You'd have said that that biscuit tin would have been drawn away by the strength of the swell, or else dashed against the Peterhof's side. Instead, it simply sat there at exactly the spot where it had fallen, and an hour after I had thrown it into the water it had shifted, perhaps only 6 or 8 inches nearer the steamer. A project was forming in my mind. I looked at the water. It was a peculiar, vitreous green. Closer under the steamer was transparent to the depth of many feet. Beneath my shoe soles the poop was hot. Overside the sea looked inexpressibly inviting. and on a sudden I turned to the drowsing captain and exclaimed, "I want to bathe." "To bathe?" The captain gazed at me. "Why not?" The captain yawned out some lethargic suggestion to the effect that to bathe would be dangerous because of the depth, as though I'd be more apt to drown in 3 miles of water than in 3 fathoms. Seafaring people are odd in that way. I don't mean in their ignorance of swimming, though, to be sure, the average sailor is seldom a swimmer. They're so, how shall I express it, so unenterprising. In the midst of adventure and romance, they are stirred by no recognition either of the adventures or the romantic. I was a city-bred youngster who had never been out of hail of the homeland before, and I possessed more enterprise in my little finger than that far-travelled captain had in the whole of his weather-worn, hulking lump of a carcass. I wanted to bathe. I wanted to bathe in the mid-Atlantic. I'd learnt to bathe in the public swimming bath near my old school, and now I wanted to try a swimming bath 3 miles deep and tilting continuously at an angle of I don't know how many degrees. The notion was gorgeous. "I can swim," I said. "You needn't be afraid." "But the waves'll sweep you away." "There aren't any waves. Watch this biscuit tin. The top of the Atlantic, at this moment, is like a string which is being twanged. The vibrations are 100 yards across, or more, and they look as though they were travelling along the string. I suppose they are travelling along the string, but a fly sitting on the string doesn't travel along with the vibrations, it only travels up and down. If I go in to bathe, I shan't be swept away." The captain hadn't thought of it in that light. He tried to argue, but my biscuit tin answered his argument, and eventually he allowed me to have the ladder lowered. I stripped, descended the ladder, and launched myself into the sea. I struck out to get clear of the ship, then ceased swimming and looked around me. The sea was coldish, but not unendurable, and anyhow I was too much in love with my situation to bother about that. Behind me, the Peterhof towered like a cliff. I had never realized before how big a 5,000-ton vessel looks from the water. At her rail I could see a cluster of the crew, watching me, the captain on the poop. From somewhere in the interior of the ship came the sound of hammering, the engineers at work, and I noticed that this sound reached me more clearly now than when I was on board. But if the Peterhof appeared strange from the water, how much stranger was the view in the opposite direction? Or rather, the absence of view. The groundswell had looked formidable when I was on the Peterhof's deck. Here, its aspect was terrific. The crystalline slope in which I was cradled seemed to reach the sky, yet, without having climbed it, I immediately found myself, instead of looking up the slope, looking down it, down an oblique abyss of gleaming profundity. I seemed to fall and fall and fall. Nevertheless, there was no spasm of nausea. Although I was falling, I was supported sensuously in my fall, and I never reached the finish of the fall. It merged, imperceptibly, into an ascent, and a moment later I was surveying a fresh trough of glassiness, or else gazing audaciously downward, downward onto the deck of the Peterhof. It was overwhelming. Never in all my life have I attained to a rapture comparable with that bathe in mid-Atlantic. I knew, even at the time, that it would be unforgettable. I had aspired to be able to say that I had swum in water 3 miles deep. Oh, never mind what vain boast I had promised myself. Boasting was forgotten. I was experiencing. I was surrendered to an ecstasy, an enchantment, a glee beyond expression, grandiose and delicious. I lolled in the pellucid water, not troubling to swim. I let myself go in those dizzy soarings and sinkings. I abandoned myself to this vast and beautiful force. I felt at once infinitely little and infinitely great. The whole adventure was half terrifying and half, well, comfortable. Perched on the crown of one of those flawless ridges, I felt, as I toppled over, that I must either be smashed to pieces at the end of the plunge or engulfed in some horrid undertow. But I knew that nothing of the sort would happen. Quietly, I paddled with my arms and feet. Almost contemptuously, I gave myself to the puissant and colossal rhythm which swayed me as high as a cathedral at every swing and then gently rocked me down as deep as a valley. I tell you, the sensation was sublime, and I hadn't even got my hair wet. I remembered, in the middle of my bliss, this perfectly incongruous fact that I hadn't got my hair wet, and I prepared to duck. But at that moment I heard a shout from the deck of the Peterhof. I turned in the water and saw that the captain was gesticulating to me, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. The crew were shouting also, and one of them had got a coil of rope over his arm and seemed to be making ready to throw it. What did they mean? Stupidly, in the tingling ardour and gusto of my enjoyment, I didn't make out, for a minute, what they were driving at. It occurred to me that they had taken it into their heads that because I wasn't swimming I had got cramp. I signalled cheerily to them, to reassure them, but they did not cease shouting. And then, as I turned again, a little, in the water, I knew. Near the skyline rim of the superb mountain range, upon which I was commencing to rise, I saw, shadowy in the translucent green, an unmistakable shape. The shape of a great fish. A shark. Its fin cut the surface like a knife. For one instant I stared, and in that instant I observed, with a vivid clearness, all manner of minute details: the burnished sheen on the water, the glistening tautness of its lofty skyline, the sapphire blue of the sky itself, and, most lucidly of all, the silhouette of the shark. Every movement of the shark was now plain to me, and it was moving, there was no doubt of it. A trail of bubbles streamed from its flank, and a tiny streak of froth fluttered behind the fin. The shark was not passive in the element, as I was. It was monarch of the waves. It could drive through them with the precision of a torpedo. I had invaded a realm which I had no business to invade, and its guardian was come to punish me. An astonishingly coherent train of reflections such as these whirled round my brain. They must have occupied a fraction of a second. I know that, at all events, I struck out for the Peterhof without any apparent pause. My arms and legs worked frantically. I swum as I had never swum before. I hurled myself through the water. Fortunately, I had gone only a very short distance from the foot of the steamer's ladder. It seemed remote enough, though, I can tell you. My eyes were bursting out of their sockets, but I could dimly see the captain leaning on the rail and shouting, and some of the men running down the ladder to receive me. Then the rope was flung. It splashed across me. I grasped it. I dug my nails into it. I clung to it with a grip so fierce that I felt as though I was crushing it. Simultaneously, the men at the other end of the rope began pulling, and I was jerked through the water in a lather of spray which swirled round my shoulders. My arms and head were above the water. I was being dragged so fast up the steamer's side. I could still see the captain, vaguely, confusedly. His mouth was open, his hands were waving, but I wasn't interested in him. I was only interested in what was pursuing behind me. Gad, that was an awful moment. I dream of it, sometimes, even now, the disgusting, obscene terror of that dash for safety, and I wake sweating with the horror of it. Harborough paused. "And how did your adventure end?" I asked. "I don't know. I lost consciousness, but I kept tight onto the rope. They hauled me on board. They told me afterwards that I hadn't even got my hair wet. But," he hesitated, "I'd had my experience, a never-to-be-forgotten experience. Dash it," he laughed. "It was almost worth it, I swear. And I'm making money now, as a novelist, whereas if I'd continued my life of rolling stone, I'd certainly have arrived in prison or the poorhouse. Yes, I suppose that every disaster has its compensations. But I confess I didn't think so when I awoke on board the Peterhof. We were plugging onwards again by that time, and found that I'd got only one leg.